For today's tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make one of these basic front walking dog costumes that you can then customize for your small dog. This is Pace. He is a foster dog. He is a mini golden doodle with a heart condition, so we are fostering him through his heart surgery. And because he needs a functioning heart, we thought the Tin Man would be the perfect Halloween costume for him. Make sure to check out the link below to get the pattern and then meet me back at the camera and I'll show you how to sew it up. All right, let's go over all the pieces you need to sew this up. Now I am just showing you how to sew up a basic suit. This is gonna end up entirely gray. And I want you to notice that this is the body portion. If you want to do any further customization on the costume, this is where you're gonna do it. So for example, if you wanted to create a contrasting shirt and pants, you would probably want to draw a line across your pattern here, add seam allowances on both sides, and cut the top and the bottom out of contrasting fabric. If you did that, you would also want the two pants legs, the two cuffs, and the gussets to be cut out of the same color as the pants fabric. You could draw or paint on this main body portion as another way to customize it. So this is really just the blank slate, and then you have to add your creativity to really turn it into a costume. But you should have your main body piece. You should have two legs, two cuffs, one gusset, four arms, two back of the arms, two of the long ties and two of the short ties. You need two 4-inch pieces of elastic for the cuffs, and you need one 8-inch piece of elastic for the back. And then you need needle and thread to do the sewing when we get to the backs of the arms here. You're also going to need a little bit of polyfill to stuff those arms, and you're going to need pins. Then two other tools that I will be using just because they're helpful are the tube turner and the bodkin, and I have those linked below if you don't have these tools. You also don't have to have these tools. You can do the tasks I'm going to do with them using just your fingers and using a safety pin in case of the bodkin, but these do make it easier to do. So let's start sewing this up. We want to sew the gusset to the main part of the body. So the gusset's going to go like this, and the main part of the body attaches right at these little short edges here. So I'm going to attach there, and I'm going to sew this with a stretch stitch. I do recommend using stretch fabric for this just because it gives you a little more ease in the fitting, and also because you don't have to worry about finishing the seams when you're using knit fabric because it doesn't fray. So I'm going to sew these two little portions here. You'll notice that I used a 1/4-inch seam allowance to sew this up, and that's the same seam allowance I will be using throughout this project. Now that those ends are sewn together, this is where I'm going to insert the leg piece. So these sort of look like little sleeves, but these are actually the legs. And I am just going to match it all along that edge and stitch it up. Okay, here is that leg sewn in, and I've sewn the other one in, and this is what it will look like when the two legs are sewn in. So now we're going to add on the cuffs to the bottom, and then we'll sew the inseams. So once again, I'm going to open this out flat. I am going to add one of the cuffs to the bottom, and then as I stitch, I'm going to stitch and stretch this piece of elastic in so that it will gather up that cuff. I have been using a lightning bolt stretch stitch to do my seams, but for this seam, I'm going to switch to a zigzag stitch. I'm using 2.5 millimeters long and 3.5 millimeters wide. Okay, here is what that looks like sewn on. And if you were going to hem this leg for some reason, I would do it now before we sew it into a loop because it would be easier doing this flat surface. Since I am using knit fabric, I'm not going to hem this. What I'm going to do instead is we're just going to place the whole thing right sides together, and we're going to match up all those seam allowances and sew this seam. All right, here is what that looks like when I've got that gusset seam sewn, And now I can turn this right side out here, and we're going to start to work now on trimming off these ends and sewing the ties on. So the first thing I want to do is take my 2 short ties. I am going to fold these long, matching the long edges, and then I want to sew across 1 short edge and down 1 long edge before I turn this right side out. Okay, once you've got those sewn, you need to turn them right side out, and I actually have a video linked here showing you 3 different ways to turn things right side out. But my favorite for this purpose is the tube turner. So you're just going to insert it into the tube and then use the stick to press the other end through. And as you can see, this quick turn tool does that really quickly. Once you have both of these tubes turned right side out, then you want to get your body, and I've got 2 dots here that are marked on the pattern. On the higher of the 2 dots, you want to go ahead and pin your tie, and then do the same thing on the other side. We want to get one of our longer 2 ties, and I am marking the center of it here. And then you want to find the center point of your gusset. So I'm matching the seams, marking the center there. And then you just want to match these 2. And once you've got that center spot matched, you want to pin all the way up to the point here. And you're going to go on top of where you've pinned the tie. You will have some excess that goes beyond the edge of the pattern. We'll cut that off in a little bit. Okay, I'm going to sew all along that edge. All right, here's what that looks like after you've sewn the first pass. And then what we're going to do is we are going to fold the edge so that it just covers the seam allowance from before. And I'm going to put my pins on the right side because I'm going to stitch this from the right side. Now, I am only going to do this up until those lower dots that we didn't use before. So let me go ahead and place my pin there, and that's where I will stop stitching on this step, and then we will insert the elastic. Okay, I'm going to stitch from this pin around to this pin. I'm going to do this on the right side, and I want to use a zigzag stitch that is going to hit on both sides of that seam allowance. So I'm going to switch to a 2.5 millimeter long, 3.5 millimeter wide zigzag. Okay, so I've created this casing with that zigzag stitch, and now I'm going to use my bodkin and to insert my elastic here. Now, you can use a safety pin to do this. I just find the bodkin easier. And what you want to do is go in from the open end of the tube and just start pulling the elastic through. Make sure that when you get the end here that you hold it, because you're going to need to stitch it. So I'm pulling pretty carefully here, just there, until the end is even with where I started my stitching. And I'm going to pin it here so that it does not go any further down. And then also be very careful on this end when you take the safety pin or the bodkin off to hold that elastic and pin it into place. Now what I'm going to do is where I'm holding the elastic here, I'm going to do a little bit of back stitching on that to keep the elastic here, and then I can remove the pins, and then we will finish stitching up with a zigzag stitch this last part of the tie. Okay, we've got the elastic, squishing that up now. We've got these raw edges finished, and now what I want to do is cut off this excess here at the top. Repeat that on the other side, cut it even with where the main piece of the body was. And we're going to finish this raw edge, and we're going to do this the same way we did the edge we just finished, except we're going to leave a whole lot of excess here for ties. So once again, I am going to match up the center with the center, and I'm going to pin that. And then just continue pinning along that raw edge. At the ends here, we're gonna end up trimming that corner off. So just kind of cross the corner. And we're going to stitch that with a stretch stitch. Okay, once we've got that neckline edge sewn, what we want to do is we're going to fold this right sides together, and we are going to stitch across the short end and then over here until we meet the edge of the costume. We're making a tube here that we're going to turn right side out before we finish this neckline edge. Okay, once you have that end sewn up, we're going to use the quick turn tube again to turn that right side out. And you can see that forms our other ties that go around the neck. So we just need to finish this neck edge now. We're going to press that seam up, and this time, since we folded that into a tube, we're going to fold a little extra here and then pin it down. And I am pinning on the right side because I am going to zigzag on the right side to finish this neckline. Okay, once we have our neckline finished with our ties, it's time to set this aside for a second to deal with the arms. So the first step I'm going to do with the arms is I want to stitch around the outer perimeter of each. Once you have stitched the arm around the edges, it looks like this, and then the next step is to turn it right side out. And remember, I'm making this all out of one color of fabric, but you can definitely use two colors, like if you wanted to make a line here to make like a sleeve and a hand, for example. You'll also notice the arms have a curve to them, so when I insert them in the costume, I'm going to do them like this so that one is kind of going up and one is going down. And so the next step, once I've got that turned right side out, is going to be to go ahead and pin that into the armhole of the costume. I'm just matching these right sides together. And then I'm going to stitch around that hole to stitch the arm into place and repeat on the other side. So here's what that looks like once the arms are sewn in, and then the next step is to go ahead and stuff them. All right, here is the costume with the arms sewn in, and then we're on the last step here, which is you've got to sew something on the back to keep all the stuffing from coming out. So we have these little circles, and this is where the hand sewing needle comes in. I'm just going to whip stitch this right onto the back of the armhole. So I'm sewing in the seam allowance from where I attached the arm and just quickly stitching this onto the back. All right, so that is what it looks like once the back is sewn on, and then essentially the bottom part of your costume is done. Anything you're putting on the head, you're going to need to figure out how to attach that to the collar, or in the case of the costume I made, I just used elastic under the chin to keep that on. Let's take a look at what my little Tin Man costume looks like inside and out, so you can see kind of how I customized some of this. Okay, the first difference you probably noticed is that I used a stretch satin. It is still a stretch fabric, not quite as stretchy as the other one that I used. And you'll notice that it looks like it has an extra seam here. What I did was I cut the top portion of the body a little bit longer, and then I did a bottom portion of the body and then like folded it over on the seam line so that it looks like his coat. For the buttons, these are literally just little dots of hot glue that I put on here to give some dimension. Since the hot glue is clear, you can see the silver through them and they look like they're silver buttons. On the arms, I added these little cuffs like he has at the shoulders. I was going to do them at the elbow too, but it was just too crowded on these little short arms. So I made little rectangles, and then I kind of cut them like this so they're a little more trapezoidal, so they're wider on this end than this end. I made two, I sewed them together along those edges, turned it all right side out, and then down here I stuck one in inside the other, hand sewed those together, and hand sewed it to the arm there and up here at the shoulder so that it doesn't slide down the arm. And then of course his funnel that he wears on his head, that was actually a miniature plastic funnel. I've spray painted it silver so that it works and punched little holes in that I put elastic through so that it can sit on his head. And here is what he looks like all done up in his costume and walking around.